He won one game in 0G and took the bride, then their discovery saved a colony. Welcome to SciFi Nebula, where we bring you human stories at the edge of the stars. Tonight, a zero-gravity saloon, a public humiliation, and a single hand of cards will set two strangers on a collision course with a megacorp, and with each other. When a jilted freighter pilot stumbles into a bet he can't afford to lose, and a frontier bioengineer wagers her future on her own terms, what begins as a desperate marriage of convenience becomes the lifeline for an entire colony. This isn't a tale about destiny written in constellations. It's a story about two people who choose, again and again, to be brave for each other. They will fight dust storms, legal ambushes, and the physics of living under constant radiation. They will also fight the quieter wars, pride, shame, and the fear of being someone's second choice. Strap in. We're heading to Copper Creek Station, year 2281, where a single full house, aces over jacks, will echo far beyond a green felt table. Chapter 1, Murphy's Cantina, the 0G Hand. The amber glow of plasma lamps drifted like slow suns inside Murphy's Cantina, pinned in place by weak mag fields while everything else swayed with the station's heartbeat. The hatch irised open and Jack, Cowboy, Sullivan let the noise roll over him, laughter, synth piano, the metallic groan of Copper Creek's ribs adjusting to Tau Ceti's fickle winds. Every face turned. They didn't have to say it, the feed had already splashed it across every stall and corridor. Catherine Ollie, the bride he'd matched on a year-long interstellar contract, had bailed with 3 lines of legalese and a radiant smile beside a Helios mining executive. A mutually advantageous reassignment, she'd called it. Translation, richer orbit, better view. Jack pretended not to notice the stairs as his boots clanged along the deck lattice. He pulled up to the bar rail and grunted, beer. Old Pete levered a tap and sent a bulb of dark liquid sailing down the rail. The bulb hit the mag lip, flattened, and redomed with surface tension. Jack caught it with the practiced hands of a cargo pilot and drank. Must sting, Billy Hatch called from a knot of Helios jumpsuits. Hatch had the blocky jaw of a rock drill and the smile of a man who never paid for his own trouble. Woman hasn't even seen you in person and still found a better orbit. Laughter prickled. Jack let it pass. He took another pull and set the bulb back to the rail, watching ripples shiver through it like wind across a pond. A shadow fell over him. Ezra Thompson, silver at the temples, shoulders like welded I-beams, hooked a boot under the foot rail and leaned one elbow beside Jack's drink. The air seemed to hush for him the way it does for storm fronts. "You're about to pickle yourself in cheap brews, son," Ezra said, voice low and even. "A man who drowns in public just teaches the river to come back." "Mind your own river," Jack said without looking. "I'm doing recon at the bottom of this glass." "Good," Ezra said, straightening. "Then recon this." He tapped the table. "One hand. Ion poker. You win, you take my daughter home, properly, with community rights. You lose, you finish that beer and find another way to live with yourself." Silence in the cantina was never total, the station hummed and the piano's autoplayer plinked in a distracted loop. But right then, even the lamps seemed to hang a little tighter in their fields. "Your daughter," Jack said, finally turning. Ezra's eyes were steel under thunderheads. "You didn't joust with Ezra, you negotiated with weather." "You know her name," Billy blurted, too pleased with himself. "Everyone knows Rose. She's cursed. 3 broken engagements. 1 fiancé ran for the outer belt in the night. Another went back to Earth citing cultural differences. 3rd, his voice trailed off with a shrug that meant dead at a mine face. Ezra didn't blink. "She's 24. Smarter than the station by halves. And she needs a man with fight. I see fight." Jack stared at the reflected lights in his beer. Catherine's smile flashed in his head, perfect, practiced, distant as a constellation. Shame rasped along his ribs like sand. "I'm not a charity case," he said. It came out more wounded than defiant. "Good," Ezra said. My daughter isn't Charity. He gestured. Old Pete, who served whiskey and justice with equal economy, produced a deck of thin polymer cards that clicked like ice when they brought them out of vacuum. Don't, someone murmured near Jack's shoulder, maybe his own common sense wearing a stranger's voice. The station's rumor web was already crocheting a wedding shroud for his pride. Jack rolled his shoulders and felt the old calm gather around him. He'd learned to read cards from drovers who'd never seen open sky and to read men from captains who could smell a lie in 12 atmospheres. Ion poker wasn't poker from Earth, it used 5 cards and physics, wildcards flickering as charged spots drifted across the faces, anchoring and releasing in patterns you could almost predict if you watched the fields. Almost. Deal, Jack said. They floated a table out, locked it to the floor magnets, and the crowd tightened like a lariat. Ezra shuffled with workmanlike efficiency, no flourishes. Old Pete set the rules in a flat baritone, one hand. No redraw. House fields at standard. Witnessed. The cards came, light as breath. Jack slid his thumb under the first. Ace of spades. The symbol glowed pale against the polymer. Good start, he told himself, and refused to believe in omens. Second card. Ace of hearts. A flex of breath moved through the crowd. Somewhere behind him, Billy swore softly. Third, Jack of diamonds. Fourth, Jack of clubs. He could feel his pulse sinking with the station generators now, steady, steady. The last card drifted a hair in its pocket as the ion spot hunted a home, then snapped. Ace of clubs. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything but breathe. Ezra set his cards down one by one, king, queen, jack, 10, 9, king high straight. Admirable. Insufficient. He nodded as though checking off a chore on a list, then lifted his eyes. Full house, Jack said, voiced the temperature of cold steel. Aces over jacks. The sound hit in layers, exhalations first, then curses, then the bright rise of disbelief gelling into cheers. Old Pete lifted a hand for order and didn't get it. He tried again and the crowd settled in ragged waves. Ezra extended his hand across the table. His grip was warm and exact. Looks like you're getting married, son. Behind Jack, Billy's voice cut like a wire saw. From one cursed bride to another. The Thompson girl poisons any man fool enough to wed her. Jack turned so smoothly the crowd forgot to breathe. He didn't reach for the sidearm he didn't wear, this wasn't the Old West and Murphy's wasn't that bar, but he let his hand find the tool belt at his hip. The gesture read the same in any century. Say it again, he invited. Billy's bravado shrank like a punctured bladder. Just, talking, he muttered. That's your first mistake, Jack said, and walked out into the Copper Creek night. The station skin thrummed softly around him, above, Tau Ceti threw down a diluted gold through the dust of the upper atmosphere. Jack's breath fogged, then cleared as he hit the corridor toward the Thompson atmospheric farm, still not sure if he'd won grace or just gone and mortgaged the rest of his life to pride. He only knew this, in a room full of witnesses, he'd taken a dare that felt like a sentence and turned it into a choice. Tonight, choice would have to be enough. Chapter 2, Frontier Vows and Rose's Conditions. The Thompson farm wasn't a field, it was a lattice, titanium arches and translucent veils catching microhumidities from the thin Tau Ceti breeze, coaxing them into beads that trembled along capillaries toward storage vats. Under the lattice, rows of heliotoma glowed a patient red, fruit the size of a pilgrim's fist, skin stippled with sunburnt gold. The plants had been gene-spliced to laugh at radiation and sip dust like wine. Rose Thompson stepped from the nursery corridor, tucking a coil of auburn hair behind one ear with a nitrile glove. Her eyes were green in a way the station rarely allowed, soft without surrender. "Daddy," she said, the word both greeting and caution. She saw Jack a heartbeat later and tipped her chin in a short nod. "So this is your storm." Ezra spread his hands. "This is Jack Sullivan." He just won the most important hand he'll ever play. Did he? No upward lilt. Rose didn't waste question marks on statements. She studied Jack the way she'd examine a leaf for mites, respectfully, completely. Jack felt a twitch in his posture and straightened, suddenly aware of the oil under his nails and the way humiliation leaves a salt crust on the skin. "Miss Thompson," he said, removing his hat by reflex he hadn't questioned since childhood. "I know this is unconventional." "Nothing about frontier life is conventional," she said, a half-smile ghosting her mouth. "But men bargaining with men about women is very old." "Daddy, I told you." Ezra lifted both palms as if heading off a dust devil. "There's a shortage coming," he said, gentle. "Helios is tightening the water quota before storm season. You can outbreed their patents with those plants of yours, but you'll need status and alliance to keep your lines fed. This is alliance. And," he aimed a look at Jack that was almost kind. "The boy needs a life that isn't a bar stool. I'm not fixing either of you. I'm offering you each other." Rose's gaze flicked back to Jack. "Are you a man who takes help like a debt?" Jack tried to meet bluntness with honest coin. "I'm a man who pays what he owes. And I don't like owing." "Good," she said. "Because if we do this, we do it my way. No one takes me home like cargo. We spend 72 hours working together, real work. You sleep in the machine bay. We eat at the same table. We argue in daylight. If, after that, you still want to braid your life to mine, we ask Chaplain Mitchell to officiate and we tell the station we chose it." She angled her head. "Not that we were one." Ezra's mouth softened, and for a moment Jack saw the worry that had been living there for years. He also saw something else, pride so cautious it walked in socked feet. Jack breathed in the green, metallic air. He hadn't come here for dignity, but some version of it had apparently been set aside for him anyway. "Deal," he said. Rose's smile sharpened into something like agreement. "Then day one starts now." They toured the lattice as the station dimmed toward artificial evening. Rose moved with efficiency, naming pump sizes, pointing out weak grips on the windward edge, nodding toward seedlings that needed propping. Jack kept pace, cataloging like a pilot, load, vector, fail points. When she paused, he was already gut deep in a clogging skimmer, arms slick with mineral slurry, laughing under his breath at how every machine everywhere told the same dirty jokes. At 0200, a dust squall rolled in from the east. The station skin sang, and the farm's veils shivered like 1,000 banners. An outlying condensate line I blinked a fault notification across Rose's wrist display. "That line feeds the worker quarters," she said, already running. "If it fails, those families ration dry until morning. Go." "I'll grab a spool and meet you at the east brace," Jack said. He didn't wait for permission. They met under a screeching arc. Rose was already hip-tied to the brace, mag boots locked, both hands elbow-deep in a coupling. Jack clipped in beside her and fed line, snapped seals, bled air. Their shoulders bumped. He felt something rearrange behind his ribs that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with recognition. This is a person built to hold in the wind. By 0300, the warning lights dropped to yellow. The line purred. Somewhere beyond the lattice, a child was going to wake to a working tap. They walked back through aisles of heliotoma dawn-night dark, the fruit absorbing and radiating heat like living coals. In the canteen, Rose poured broth into 2 bowls and slid one to Jack. He sniffed and made a face. "Don't insult my broth," she said, deadpan. "It's 90% tap water, 10% humility." "I'm familiar," he said. And then, because honesty had gotten him this far, "I'm sorry for the spectacle in Murphy's." "You mean the part where my father staked my future on your ability to stack aces?" Her mouth crooked. "We all bring what we have to the table, Mr. Sullivan. Daddy brought barroom theater. You brought a straight face. She gestured at the bowl. "I bring plants. We try to make meaning out of what we're holding. Jack, he said. Rose, she said, and the word felt like a door opening. Day 2 was repairs and delivery. The worker ring had taken more dust than usual and the poorer families had rationed through. Jack's freighter Juniper wasn't much to look at, but she could haul, and Jack knew the back corridors where Helios traffic monitors looked the other way. Helios will fine you for using a non-licensed lane, Rose warned as they loaded crates of seedlings and water bulbs. They can stand in line, Jack said. Behind the Cosmos. She shot him a sideways look that might have been amusement. They flew, bump-hopping the station's micrograph pockets. In the worker ring, Jack waved off a half-dozen eager tippers and left water bulbs on stoops. Rose talked with a woman on crutches twice as long as business required, laughing in soft bursts. The woman reached for Rose's hand and squeezed it, and Jack felt the station tilt in a new way. Day 3, Chaplain Mitchell pinged Ezra and asked how many guests to expect. Ezra pinged back a shrug emoji and a verse about deserts flowering. Jack spent the morning in the machine bay, on his back under the Juniper, swapping a cracked coolant line. He didn't sleep. He didn't want to. At sundown, Rose found him, grease to her elbows, a smudge along her cheek like war paint. Well, she asked, simple as a spanner. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and realized his mouth was dry. The edge of fear felt clean. I don't gamble on people, he said. But if I did, I'd push all my credits in right now. Rose breathed out once, like a held note releasing. All right, she said. Then we choose each other out loud. The wedding wasn't lace and choirs, it was a semicircle of neighbors in work boots, heliotoma blossoms in jam jars, the station dimmed to a soft rust. Chaplain Mitchell's avatar materialized, an androgynous silhouette woven out of language and light. By the authority granted me by the Copper Creek Charter and the grace you extend to one another, Mitchell intoned, I witness this covenant. Not a prize taken. A promise made. Jack had found credits he didn't have to buy a new jacket. Rose had cut a pair of rings from lattice wire, polished until they shone like captured day. Ezra stood behind them, eyes like weather again, except this time the storm had passed and left water in the gullies. Do you, Jack Sullivan, Mitchell asked, choose Rose Thompson, this mind, this body, this stubborn will, to be your partner? In dust and harvest, in injury and healing, in scarcity and in more than enough. I do, Jack said, feeling every word slot into place like parts machined to tolerance. Do you, Rose Thompson, choose Jack Sullivan, this courage, this temper, this ridiculous hat, to be your partner? In dust and harvest, in injury and healing, in scarcity and in more than enough. Rose's laugh startled a real smile out of the crowd. I do. Then by the law you make together, Mitchell said, be home to one another. They kissed awkwardly at first, two practical people practicing something impractical in front of witnesses, and then less awkwardly. The cheers rose like thrust. Billy Hatch was nowhere to be seen. Catherine Ali's smile haunted no one. Later, when the neighbors had drifted away and the lattice hummed with night, Jack carried his roll to the machine bay and threw it down between the Juniper's landing struts as promised. He lay on his back and watched the dark. He thought of 72 hours that had changed the topography of him. He thought of Rose's hands on the condensate line, steady inside chaos. He slept, and when he woke near dawn to the soft thrum of the station and the scent of tomato-sweet air, he realized he hadn't gotten up once in the night. Not once. He lay very still, listening to the quiet between his bones, and understood that some changes happen to you like weather. Others, you choose. And sometimes, miracle of miracles, the weather listens. Chapter 3, Hunger, Radiation, and the Red Clue. Scarcity has a way of simplifying menus. By the third lean week, their table looked like a study in red, heliotoma sliced over flatbread, heliotoma stewed into a thin sauce, heliotoma broiled until the skins blistered and leaked sweet and metallic juices onto tin plates. Rose apologized once, early, and Jack shrugged it off. "I've eaten worse in nicer rooms," he said, which somehow made her laugh and stop apologizing. Nights on Copper Creek were long and humming. The station's heartbeat threaded through the lattice and into bones. Jack had grown used to waking 2-3 times, cursing at 0300 as he shuffled to the head, waiting for his body to remember how to be a body under constant spin and radiation. Old freighter pilots called it station bladder, the price of a lifetime in recycled air. Except he wasn't waking. On the 5th morning of not waking, he sat up in the machine bay with his heart pounding as if he'd missed a shift. He checked the time. 0612, he'd slept through. His body felt unstrangled. The dull ache under his ribs had gone quiet. When Rose came down with coffee, the precious, thin kind stretched with chicory, he said it aloud like a confession. "I didn't get up last night. Not once." She set the cup on the floor between his boots and looked at him, not at his words. "How long has it been happening?" "The getting up." "Couple years," he said. "Worse since I took the Helena run. The magnetic sheathing on that route is cheap." "And now?" she asked, not teasing. "Now it isn't," he said. She leaned back against the strut and breathed out slow. "We've been eating heliotoma 3 meals a day. You're the only variable that changed. I mean, aside from marriage, which I refuse to credit as a urological cure." He huffed. "So you think it's the fruit?" "I think," Rose said, "that the lycospectrum in heliotoma isn't just a color. There's a compound, call it heliophenone for now, that binds up radiation byproducts and protects soft tissue. We designed heliotoma to laugh at tau ceti, maybe it's teaching our cells to laugh, too." It sounded like hope, and that's where Jack usually grew cautious. "Hope had a way of owing you interest." "Can you test it?" he asked. "I can try," she said, and the softness left her face, replaced by focus. "But not with just you. Anecdotes are nice at dinner and useless everywhere else." They started with whispers. Rose posted in the women's channel and asked a question that made wives and partners answer in torrents. "Do your men wake 3 times a night? Do they stop midstream and swear at nothing?" The thread lit up like a flare. The older the man, the more yes. Some added details and curses Jack hadn't heard yet, which was impressive. Rose took the thread to Dr. James Hartwell, a man whose credentials hung in his office like museum pieces nobody dusted. He wore his Harvard with the absent-mindedness of someone who'd peeled off an old skin and found he liked the air underneath better. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, folding into the stool beside his bench. "Frontier medicine already has enough folk cures. If this is another miracle berry. What if it's a protectant against low-dose radiation and microgravity stress?" Rose cut in. "What if we've been growing the antidote to our own infrastructure?" Hartwell's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. "You have data?" "I have a pilot who sleeps through," she said, tipping her chin toward Jack in the doorway. "I have a community thread that reads like a clinical intake. And I have 5 miners willing to eat heliotoma twice a day for 2 weeks and log their symptoms in exchange for seedlings and the joy of not hating their bladders." Hartwell tapped a stylus against the bench. "You'll need controls. I can't deprive half the miners of fresh fruit and call it science," Rose said. "But I can compare their baselines to their own trajectories. And you can pull blood markers, oxidative stress, inflammatory cytokines, any surrogate you trust this far from Earth." Hartwell waited. When he finally spoke, it came out as a concession shaped like a challenge. "Fine. We'll measure what we can in a room that shakes when a dust devil sneezes. You'll keep logs. I'll keep skepticism." They enrolled 5 men whose faces were carved by the mine's electric dusk. The first morning, Rose handed each a pouch of sliced heliotoma like communion. "Twice a day. No cheating." And marked the nocturia scale next to the clock time. "If the numbers go down, we smile later." The station didn't pause for experiments. Jack spent his days running the Juniper between supply nodes, bartering for filters, pulling old fans from dead farms and coaxing them back to life with parts that had forgotten they were parts. Nights, he helped Rose process fruit, blanch and skin, crush and simmer until the room smelled like summer inverted into steel. At the end of week 1, Hartwell slid a stool back with a squeal and pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's small," he said, "and every variable on this rock is a bully." "But?" Rose prompted. "But the markers look better," he admitted. "Oxidative stress down across the board. Self-reports show fewer night wakings, less urgency, less," he coughed. "Colorful vocabulary." Rose didn't cheer. She nodded, once, like a mechanic watching an engine find its idle. By the end of week 2, the charts had firmed up into something you could point at without feeling foolish. Word wandered faster than any courier: Sullivan fruit helps a man sleep like he remembers being young. Miners came by on off shifts, fidgeting in doorways. Ezra handled the foot traffic with the patience of a man who'd learned to mend fences by mending people first. "We can't keep selling raw fruit," Rose said one night, staring at the crates as if the math would rearrange itself. "We need a concentrate. Stable. Measurable. Dose-controlled." Jack twirled a screwdriver between fingers. "Name it and I'll build it." "I'm naming it Sullivan Red," she said, almost shy, as if she were asking to paint the station a brighter color. Jack held her gaze. "Then let's make it real." Chapter 4, The Red Formula, Dust, Power Loss, and a First Kiss. They built a lab in an unused bay, the kind that had once stored crates of Helios parts and now stored other people's intentions. Jack raided the salvage market for a centrifuge missing a motor, a vacuum still that had forgotten it was still, and a spectrometer that had long ago made peace with being a glorified lamp. He brought them home like stray dogs. Rose cleaned and calibrated, coaxing the machines into a choir. The protocol took shape in layered steps: blanch to loosen skins and denature what shouldn't survive, cold press to protect the fragile bits, reduction under low-temp vacuum until the extract ran thick and bright as arterial blood. Rose measured heliophenol proxies by absorption peaks and cursed softly when the lines wobbled. Jack adjusted the power feeds until the wobble steadied. They ran batches and binned the ones that smelled wrong. Rose kept notes that read like prayer: batch 12, sweet, metallic, peak at 482 nanometers steady, batch 13, burnt, 3 bubbles of shame, discard. Within a week, they had vials lined like soldiers on a shelf, each stamped with a date, a batch number, and the crude logo Jack had sketched on a lunch bag, a stylized ace over Jack tucked inside a seed, as if luck were a thing you could plant. "By early next year," Rose said, "we file with the Interstellar Patent Office. But filing costs water and credits we don't have." "I've got a man who owes me for a de-icer I rebuilt," Jack said. "And a father-in-law who pretends he doesn't keep a savings of favors." Ezra made a show of grumbling. He also slid a quota voucher across the table and refused to put a number on the loan. "I'm investing in sleep," he said. "I turn monstrous without it." The community became their quiet partner. Dr. Hartwell wrote a recommendation letter stiff enough to stand on its own: provisional efficacy under frontier conditions, 0 adverse events to date, plausible mechanism of action. He didn't call it a cure. He called it a tool. On Copper Creek, tools were holy. Then the storm rolled in. Dust on Tau Ceti wasn't dust like Earth's, it was charged and mean, a billion ground glass knives set humming by the planet's magnetics. The forecast went from orange to red in half an hour. Alarms chased each other around the ring. The station skin bellowed. The lattice flexed like a giant breathing shallow. Power hiccuped. The lab lights dimmed, then brightened, then died. "Backup?" Jack said. "Battery for monitors, not for the vacuum still," Rose answered, eyes already calculating the half-life of failure. "If the temp spikes, we denature the compound. We lose the batch. We might lose the whole line." Jack was already moving. "I'll pull a bypass from the east grid," he said, grabbing a coil of heavy cable. Keep the temp stable with ice from the condenser. I'll bring the juice. Jack, the wind. Winds don't read warning signs, he said, and kissed her forehead without thinking about the audience of 2 moons and 1 bewildered father-in-law. Back in 5. He clipped his mag boots to the rail and hauled himself along the spine of the lattice into a night of red knives. The station moaned as gusts loaded and unloaded her ribs. Dust haloed his headlamp, turning the world into a snow globe filled with rust. At the east brace, the AUX line glowed cool and useless, tripped out with a fault. Jack locked his hip to a stanchion, peeled the panel, and worked bare-handed because gloves turn fingers into strangers. Static snapped at him like annoyed cats. He ran the coil, bridged the stubborn gap, and heard the shift before he saw it. The lab's vacuum still found its breath again and exhaled. On the way back, a gust picked him clean off the rail. The tether went taut, whiplash fast, and for one bright stupid second he was weightless in honest space with a view of Tau Ceti gnawing its way through cloud. He laughed once, sharp and frightened, and pulled hand over hand until the rail was under his gloves again. He didn't think about falling. Falling wasn't a verb here. It was a verdict. He dropped into the bay on shaking legs. Rose stood over the still, hair snapped loose from its tie, cheek streaked with dust. The temp readouts had just settled back into the safe band. When she saw him, something in her set position melted. "You're late," she said, though the clock said he was early for any reasonable rescue. He opened his mouth to smart back and couldn't find the air. She closed the distance in 2 strides and kissed him, a quick, fierce punctuation mark that landed precisely where words would have failed. "Don't make a habit of that," she said, breath unsteady. "The kissing," he teased, shaky. "The part where the tether sings," she said. Then, quieter, "the kissing we can discuss." They babysat the batch through the night, taking turns dozing in chairs while the vacuum still purred like a cat taught to respect pressure differentials. At 0600, the storm rolled off toward the industrial belt, and Copper Creek exhaled as one organism. They drew the first vial of Sullivan Red from the newly stabilized protocol and held it up to the weak morning. The liquid caught the light and turned it into a trick of memory: sun on old earth brick, blood under healthy skin, the inside of a ripe fruit promising sweetness without a guarantee. "Let's test it," Rose said. They ran it through quality checks Rose had invented out of stubbornness and borrowed science. The peaks held. The color didn't oxidize. Hartwell came by with a clinical solemnity that didn't mask his grin very well. "Provisional approval to dispense under observation," he said, signing a form that meant nothing to any planet but everything to this station. People came in 2s and 3s, hats in hands, hopeful without saying hope's name. Jack worked the counter while Rose walked them through dosage like she was teaching them to handle a new tool: 1 capful with food, morning and evening, report changes, good or bad, come back in a week with your own story in your own words. By noon, the shelf looked like a mouth with missing teeth. By evening, Ezra had to move a chair outside and direct foot traffic. By nightfall, a woman hugged Rose so hard the vials clinked in their box. 2 nights, the woman whispered, voice fierce. "My husband slept 2 nights through. He hasn't done that since the year we arrived. He smiled this morning. I'd forgotten what that looks like on him." Rose nodded after every sentence like she was soldering something delicate in place. When the woman left, she leaned her forehead against Jack's shoulder, just for a breath. "What we're doing," she said, like she needed to hear it stated plain, "matters." Jack thought of the aces over Jack's logo he'd sketched without planning, the silly way luck and choice dance around each other in this life. He thought of the tether song and the kiss that followed. He rested his cheek in her dusty hair and said, "It does." Outside, the moons traded places. Inside, a small army of red vials waited for morning. And somewhere in the worker ring, a man rolled over and did not wake until the light did, and the world was different by the size of that sleep. Chapter 5, The Laugh and the Threat. The first sign Helios had noticed was the way the station got quiet when their people walked by. The second sign was the cease-and-desist wrapped in a smile. They arrived mid-morning in gray compliance jackets that matched their expressions. Billy Hatch led, flanked by two legal reps whose badges shimmered with shifting seals. Behind them came a camera drone wearing Catherine Ali's face like a mirror, composed, luminous, never accidentally human. "We'll keep this efficient," one lawyer said, voice clean as a scalpel. Helios Mining petitions Copper Creek to issue an immediate injunction against the manufacture, distribution, and marketing of any unlicensed bioactive compound produced by the entity styling itself, Sullivan read. Section 14.3 of the Colonial Health Code covers unapproved therapeutics. Also, your production may compromise local water quotas. We reserve the right to audit your condensate usage and levy penalties. Rose didn't move. Jack watched her shoulders, the way they stayed level, the way she let silence do some of the lifting. Dr. Hartwell stepped out from the lab behind her, lab coat zipped like armor. "You've read my letter," he said. "We're dispensing under observation with informed consent. There have been no adverse events." "Which is delightful," the second lawyer said, as if complimenting a child's drawing. "And irrelevant. The law requires authorization. You lack it. Therefore, shut it down." Billy's grin showed up late and too wide. "Or," he mused, "you could sell the process to someone who knows how to bring it to market without killing anybody. We'll even put your names on the plaque." He turned to the hovering drone. "Roll, please." Catherine's face brightened as if someone had turned her up. "Good morning, Copper Creek," she said to the colony at large. "Catherine Ali here with Helios. We're thrilled by community innovation, but we want to keep you safe. Unlicensed concoctions, however well-meaning, can be dangerous. Helios stands ready to offer a partnership to the Sullivans that brings proper oversight and scale." Her gaze found Jack past the lens. For a fraction of a second the media smile slipped and the old, familiar smile looked out. Not apology, recognition. Jack felt an old ache reach for a chair inside him and then felt himself not offer it one. "Helios didn't invent heliotoma," Rose said, cool and plain. "Helios didn't see it because profit margins didn't circle it in bright ink. Our neighbors funded this with sleep and small hope. We'll take authorization, not acquisition." Ezra stepped forward like weather rolling in, thumbs hooked in his belt. "You want a fight, sons," he told the lawyers without heat, "make it in a room meant for fights. Not at my daughter's door." The lead lawyer inclined her head, satisfied, the script had gotten to its next line. "Then we'll see you at the Colonial Committee hearing, 2 days hence. In the meantime, shut down production. Non-compliance will be noted." Billy lingered as the lawyers peeled off, camera drone purring. He tapped the edge of the counter with a knuckle. "You always did like bets, cowboy," he said softly to Jack. "Mine's on you flinching." Jack held his gaze. "Change your odds," he said. "You're bad at math." When they were gone, the lab felt too large and too small at once. Rose rubbed a hand across the bridge of her nose, left a streak of red dust, didn't bother to wipe it away. "They'll try to drag this into a room where procedure outvotes evidence," she said. "We need both." "We have Hartwell," Jack said. "We have the logs. We have a community ready to talk if the committee lets them. We also have a quota Helios can squeeze," Ezra added, eyes on the water meters. "They can starve you with paperwork until you sell just to keep the taps on." The afternoon dripped away in paperwork and triage. Rose posted a notice, "No sales until the hearing, free doses only for those already enrolled," administered under Hartwell's eye. Ezra hated the math, he didn't argue it. Jack ran the routes to keep the lights on and came home late to find Catherine waiting under the lattice edge, the drone parked off to the side like a patient pet. "5 minutes," she said, palms open. "Off record." Jack looked past her at Rose inside the bay, tape measuring a stack of crates like numbers could square a circle. He looked back. 2. I didn't set the match aside because it was you, Catherine began, words clipped short, like they'd been edited by a clock. I set it aside because I like to breathe without counting my breaths. Helios buys air by the ton. You buy it by the minute. Do you understand? Jack let the word sit. I understand what you chose, he said. We all choose. A flicker crossed her face. They'll ruin you, she said, softer. If they can't buy you, they'll break you as a warning. Then they'll have to get in line, Jack said. He could hear his own voice and was vaguely surprised at how steady it sounded. Catherine's eyes searched his for a beat longer than was professional. You look happier, she said, and the admission seemed to cost her. Good luck, Jack. He nodded and watched her go, drone in tow. He stood on the threshold a moment with the dust and the night and the little edge of sorrow that comes when an old story finally knows it's over. Inside, Rose was marking a form with neat, uncompromising strokes. She didn't ask what Catherine had said. Jack didn't volunteer it. He dropped into the chair across from her and put both hands on the table like he was surrendering. He wasn't. I need to say a thing badly so we can keep doing everything else well, he said. Sometimes I still feel like the man who won you on a dare. Rose set down the stylus. Her eyes found his and held. And sometimes I still feel like the woman who got used as a wager by men who love me and don't always know how to show it. Neither of those feelings gets to drive. We choose. Do you understand? He did. It felt like standing on a deck that had finally decided not to pitch under him. He reached across and she met him halfway, their hands made a shape that felt like a promise without needing to be said out loud. 2 days, she murmured, as if speaking to the clock. We build a case that respects both the law and the truth. He can laugh, she added, meaning Billy, meaning Helios, meaning the whole gravity of power. We won't. That night, Copper Creek spun according to its engineering, not its fears. Jack lay awake for a while and didn't get up once. He wasn't counting. He noticed anyway. 2 days later, the committee chamber felt like a pressure suit, stiff, necessary, faintly ridiculous. The room had been built to host dignitaries who never came. Today, it held neighbors in clean shirts, Helios lawyers, a clutch of board staffers, and a 3-person panel, Supervisor Mbeki from Infrastructure, Judge Nguyen from Systems, and Clerk Sorensen, who counted votes and already looked tired of numbers. Rose wore her work jacket. Jack wore the same. Dr. Hartwell carried a case like he was bringing a reluctant cat to the vet. The lawyer with the scalpel voice went first. Emergency injunction, she intoned. Unapproved compound. Risk to public health. Risk to water allocation. Demand for immediate cessation, seizure of product, and fines. Judge Nguyen drummed fingers once against the table and stopped. Responses? Hartwell stood. I don't do speeches, he said, which was itself a speech. This compound isn't a miracle. It's a tool. Under frontier conditions, it appears to reduce symptoms associated with radiation and microgravity stress in the male genitourinary tract. Small sample. Strong signal. No adverse events to date. I'm requesting provisional authorization to continue under observation while we collect real data the hard way. Feelings, Billy muttered from the gallery. Tomato juice and feelings. Mr. Hatch, Supervisor Mbeki said without looking. Sit down or I'll weld you to the chair. Rose presented logs on a borrowed display, time-stamped doses, self-reports, crude but consistent biomarkers Hartwell had been able to pull with the tools they had. She didn't talk like a marketer. She talked like a mechanic who wanted a thing to work and could show you where it did and where it didn't. She closed with the only sentence that mattered, we're not asking you to believe us. We're asking you to watch with us. The Helios Council smiled, patient and predatory. Charming, she said. but not compliant. Also, there is precedent for resolving local disputes by custom. This colony has a quaint tradition of letting ion poker settle disagreements. If the Sullivans are so confident, perhaps they'll accept a public match today. Win, and Helios withdraws our petition. Lose, and you cease production and assign all process notes to a responsible corporate steward. The murmur that followed was half amusement, half hunger for spectacle. Billy leaned back, satisfied, he'd found the vein. Catherine, 3 rows up, didn't smile. Jack felt the old gravity tilt, felt the way rooms like this wanted to make him the man he used to be. The green felt table in Murphy's flashed in his head, and the full house that had been a mercy in bar light. He stood. He looked at Rose, at Ezra, at Hartwell, at neighbors with their hats twisting in their hands. He looked at the panel. No, he said, and the word landed like a chair put firmly on a floor. I don't gamble with medicine. And I don't let a megacorp turn our lives into content. We'll settle this by the only custom that should matter here, transparency. Supervisor Mbecky's mouth twitched, which might have been approval or gas. And your alternative? Open monitoring, Jack said. Pick 20 current users and 10 matched controls who've never taken Sullivan Red. Fit them with med patches that stream anonymized data to your office and Hartwell's, sleep segments, nocturia events, heart rate variability, whatever your system's judge trusts. Give us 7 days. If the signal isn't there, we shut down and I sweep this floor for free for a year. If the signal is there, you grant provisional authorization while we pursue full approvals. No sales, only supervised dispensing, until then. The Helios lawyer opened her mouth and shut it again. The panel's counsel conferred in a hawk's whisper. Clerk Sorensen began calculating something even before anyone asked him to. 7 days, Judge Nguyen said at last. Limited scope. Daily uploads to committee storage. Dr. Hartwell oversees. No expansion of dosing and no marketing. Helios will have access to the same dashboards in read-only mode. At the end, we reconvene. And the injunction? Rose asked. Stayed, Nguyen said. For 7 days. Helios counsel inclined her head like a blade accepting a whetstone. We accept the conditions, she said. And reserve the right to object to the methodology. Noted, Sorensen said without looking up. The gavel came down with the ceremonial thunk of a prop that still meant something. The room exhaled in 36 different dialects of relief and worry. Catherine didn't look at Jack. Jack didn't look for her. Outside the chamber, the station air tasted like recycled dust and possibility. Rose stood very still for a moment, then let out a breath she'd been holding since the lawyer said Section 14.3. You could have played, Ezra said quietly, not as a challenge but as an observation about the man he'd met in a bar. I did, Jack said, and took Rose's hand. I just changed the game. Chapter 6, Data, Doubt, and a door held open. The 7 days moved like a long hallway lit by flickering bulbs. Every morning, Hartwell and Rose fitted med patches to 20 volunteers and 10 controls, adhesive squares that warmed to the skin and woke their sensors with a polite buzz. Every evening, Clerk Sorensen's server gulped anonymized streams into a hungry directory labeled temporary. Helios watched from behind glass, their read-only access a form of surveillance disguised as collaboration. Day 1 was a lesson in what not to trust. Patches peeled off in showers, a miner fell asleep on a heater and fried a sensor, software decided all nocturia events were just steps, and the station's central clock slipped by 40 seconds during a dust squall. I hate data, Sorensen muttered, bent over his console at midnight. It's just lies that haven't been caught yet. Day 2, the patches stuck better. The sleep segments began to look like sleep. The nocturia events trended down on the treatment arm and sideways on the control. Hartwell refused to smile and failed. Helios filed a note questioning whether the men in the treatment group had simply stopped drinking water at night because of superstition. Sorensen added a column to track late evening intake and sent Helios a copy with the blandness of a saint. Day 3, Billy dropped a rumor in the worker ring. Sullivan Red had lead in it from corroded condensers. The rumor grew claws. Ezra walked the ring himself, sleeves rolled, opened the still in front of whoever asked, showed them stainless, not rust. Hartwell posted a 3-line message in the public channel, lead content, ND, non-detect. Assay attached. Go to bed. Day 4, Catherine pinged the committee channel with an informational packet about placebo effects in frontier populations. The packet included a clip of Jack at Murphy's, winning the van. The implication hummed, this started as a stunt. It is still a stunt. Rose watched the clip once, jaw set, and closed it. We keep working, she said. Day 5, a man on the control arm cracked and asked for a dose. The rules were clear, not until the hearing. He swore and said he'd take it from a friend. Rose said gently, please don't. He didn't. That night, he had 4 night wakings and recorded every one with angry precision, as if accuracy could avenge him. Day 6, the aggregate began to look like a shape instead of a noise. Rose ran the dashboards before dawn, alone in the lab, and felt something tighten behind her eyes that wasn't exhaustion. The treatment group's nocturia events had slid down a slope like a sled finding gravity. The control line wobbled on a ridge. It wasn't perfect. It was real. Don't call it yet, Hartwell warned, appearing in the doorway with hair like a dandelion that had lost an argument. Wait for day 7. Let the numbers finish their sentence. Fine, Rose said, but I am privately rehearsing a fist pump. Jack worked the routes like a man trying to keep a machine from noticing it was held together by hope and habits. He changed a filter in the worker ring and found the kid who'd once trailed him for a whole afternoon asking questions about cargo straps and orbital mechanics now trailing him again. You going to win? The kid asked. We're not playing, Jack said. You know what I mean, the kid said, and scuffed a shoe against the deck. Jack thought of how many times the word win had been a trap. He looked at the kid's ears, flushed with a hope he recognized and didn't want to betray. We're going to show, he said. And I think the showing will be enough. Night bled toward morning and the station held. On day 7, a message came in that didn't care about schedules. Collapse at the water mine. Multiple injuries. Medbeds full. Need anything that helps. The room shifted around the words. Hartwell grabbed his case. Rose grabbed a crate. Jack grabbed keys he didn't remember setting down. Ezra shouted after them to mind the dust and then moved to the comms console to turn their nervousness into logistics. The mine's mouth looked like a jaw that had lost a fight. Dust hung in the air in sheets. The triage zone thrummed with too many bodies and too few hands. A medic waved them in without the usual gatekeeping because it was day 7 and people were bleeding. Under supervision, Hartwell said, as if he were reminding himself where the line was. Enrolled patients first. Document every dose. Mark adverse anything, even if you think it's silly. They moved. The men who'd been on Sullivan Red already reported what they'd been reporting: fewer night wakings, less urgency, less cursing at their own bodies after 12-hour shifts in pressure suits. The men who hadn't asked because pride is a hungry god asked now. Hartwell nodded once and started a compassionate use ledger with slashes and initials. Rose dispensed, explaining dosage in the same calm tone she'd used to teach someone to tie a line. A manager in a clean jacket tried to wedge in with a warning about liability. Billy tried to help by yelling about poison. No one had time for either. Jack put a hand on Billy's shoulder and moved him bodily 3 steps to the left. You're in the way, he said. There are better places to be what you are. The MedPatch uploads from the mine hammered Sorensen's server like rain on a tin roof. He would later admit he cried once at his console and blamed dust. The numbers didn't care, they simply did what numbers do when reality keeps its side of the bargain. By sundown, the worst of the bleeding had stopped. Men propped themselves on elbows, blinking as if every blink cost less than it usually did. A wife hugged Rose hard enough to knock a vial against her ribs. "You don't know us," the woman said, eyes bright. "You helped us like we were yours." "We are," Rose said, and didn't know she had said it until the woman smiled like a door opening onto light. They limped home beneath a sky that looked washed. Ezra put bowls in front of them and told them to chew. Hartwell fell asleep on a chair and woke himself with a snore. The lab lights hummed the pitch of tired victory. In the committee's storage, the graphs drew themselves with tidy cruelty. Treatment lines down. Control lines flat or bad. Heart rate variability up in the right places. Night wakings fewer. The shape that had been forming for 6 days finally stepped into the room and cleared its throat. Jack found Rose standing in the doorway to the machine bay, looking like a person who had put down a heavy thing and hadn't quite noticed yet. He wanted to say a speech. He said the thing he'd already said and would keep saying until they didn't need it anymore. "We choose," he murmured. She leaned into him and said, not as a correction but as an addition, "and the numbers agree." They went to sleep for the last time before the hearing and slept like people who had work in the morning and enough breath to do it. Chapter 7, The Second Room of Truth. The committee reconvened under lights that always felt a shade too honest. Word of the mine collapse had swollen the gallery with faces Jack knew by first name and habit. Clerk Sorensen had the look of a man who had slept beside his server and dreamed in spreadsheets. Helios arrived polished, counsel in graphite, Billy Hatch in a new jacket he hadn't earned, and a camera drone that held a practiced smile a meter off the floor. Catherine Ollie took a back row seat, hands quiet in her lap. Judge Nguyen handled preliminaries with the same brisk mercy he applied to faulty airlocks. "We asked for a week of data," he said. "We got 7 days and a disaster. I'll allow a brief update on the mine." Dr. Hartwell spoke first, short, spare, and specific. "Compassionate use doses were logged and supervised," he said. "No adverse events recorded. Several patients reported immediate symptom relief unrelated to acute trauma care, consistent with prior reports." He nodded to Rose. "Mrs. Sullivan." Rose pulled up dashboards with thumbnails of numbers that had once been just wishes. Night wakings tracked like beads sliding down a string for the treatment group, the control line jittered sideways, then spiked on the night of the collapse as fear and dehydration conspired. HRV, heart rate variability, improved where it should have, small but stubborn. Intake logs, patch adherence, error bars that told the truth without screaming it. "We monitored what we could under frontier conditions," she said. "If you require better, give us better tools. Until then, this is what we have, and it's real." Helios Council lifted one eyebrow a fraction. "Fascinating. Also, inadequate. Placebo effects, self-reporting bias, patch drift, pick your poison." A hand went up in the gallery, tentative, then firm. Supervisor Mbeki sighed. "We're not turning this into a town hall, but, one witness." Brief. A man in a mine jacket stood. Dust had turned the creases of his face into underlines. "I was a control," he said, nodding at Sorensen's chart. "Wanted to be noble about it. Last night I begged for the red stuff," he admitted, a laugh twitching at his mouth. "They told me to wait. So I waited. And I got up 4 times and swore like a fool every one." He spread his hands. "I'm ready to stop being noble." Soft laughter, tired and grateful, rippled through the room. It wasn't science. It was a context. Judge Nguyen let it sit where it fell. Helios Council recovered the narrative with a smile you could shave with. "Even if we grant a signal, there's the law. Section 14.3 exists because good intentions built in garages have killed people. Also, we have new information." She gestured, the drone projected a contract template, technology transfer and stewardship. Helios offers to license this process, assume liability, fast-track broader trials, and compensate the Sullivans fairly. The numbers on the fairly line were large enough to make the room tilt. Ezra didn't move. Jack, who once would have looked at that many zeros and felt the old hunger wake, kept his eyes on Rose. "Before you sign my daughter's work into a lab it won't survive," Ezra said, voice mild as a warning. "You might address a document I found on the colony net at 3 this morning." He tapped his wrist. Sorensen grunted and pushed a file to the main display. It was a research memo internal to Helios, 6 months old, sterile tone, tidy figures. Candidate compound, heliaphene. Observed GU symptom mitigation in rodent models under simulated microgravity. Conclusion, non-core to present portfolio, proceed only if consumer demand emerges. A low, collective sound moved through the room like a front. Counsel's jaw tightened by a millimeter. "We review many leads," she said. "We cannot chase them all." "Yet here you are," Hartwell murmured. Judge Nguyen rapped the table, once. "Enough grandstanding. We're voting on an authorization question, not conducting a morality play." He turned to Sorensen. "Summarize." Sorensen didn't clear his throat. He looked like a man who had swallowed a handful of sand and decided to digest it on principle. "The delta between treatment and control is statistically meaningful by any threshold we've ever used here," he said, tapping through panels. 7 days is 7 days, but the effect size is not coy. No safety flags. Documentation is messy but legible. My recommendation is provisional authorization with strict reporting, no open market sales, and a path to full approval assuming continued signal and clean safety. Supervisor? Nguyen asked. Becky folded his hands. Copper Creek lives or dies on tools we can trust. I don't care who gets credit as long as it works and doesn't break the water. He paused, then added, almost softly, and I don't reward companies for noticing us only when we notice ourselves first. He looked to Rose. You'll operate under infrastructure oversight. Helios Council rose. We object to the process, the timeline, and the insinuation. Duly noted, Nguyen said, and brought the gavel down. Provisional authorization granted. Production remains limited to supervised dispensing. Helios injunction is vacated. Further, Helios will contribute materials and power to the clinic for 30 days in recognition of last night's emergency. He stared over the bench until the drone politely found somewhere else to point. The room didn't erupt, it breathed, which was better. Ezra's hand landed on Jack's shoulder and squeezed once, father to son, weather to weather. Hartwell looked like a man who'd gotten away with feeling something in public and was deciding to be all right with it. Catherine stood. For a moment the room's edges narrowed to the two of them. I didn't leak that memo, she said before he could wonder it aloud. I didn't think you did, Jack said. She nodded, relieved and a little sad. I'm going back to the inner ring. There's always another message to read into a lens. A beat. I like who you are when you're not trying to be someone else. Me too, he said, and meant it as a benediction for both of them. Billy drifted close, wearing a scowl built from spare parts. You didn't win, he muttered. Jack looked past him to where Rose was laughing with a neighbor, head tipped back, the line of worry between her brows gone smooth. I chose, he said. Turns out that's better. Outside, Copper Creek's corridors filled with the small, busy sounds of people getting on with the business of staying. The Sullivans walked back to the lattice under light that felt earned. Chapter 8, Home is the thing you build. They didn't throw a party so much as set out extra chairs. Sullivan Red moved from shelf to hand to sleep to morning. The clinic expanded into the next bay with Helios's reluctant power and the community's cheerful labor. Infrastructure sent a tech to help Rose with a real spectrometer. The kid went home talking about absorption peaks like a person newly in love. The Interstellar Patent Office pinged receipt of a provisional filing, nothing like a crown, everything like a seat at the table. Ezra signed papers he'd never imagined reading, let alone understanding, and then went out to mend a fence because some rituals keep a man from floating off. Hartwell set up a boring little rhythm of follow-up days and checklists that made Jack fall a little further in love with the dull glory of maintenance. Copper Creek learned a new word, titrate, and used it in sentences about life and dignity and not getting up so damn much at night. Helios pivoted to benevolence with the grace of a large creature turning in a narrow hallway. They filmed a spot about supporting local innovation and didn't mention memos. Catherine didn't narrate it. There were still bad days. A batch spoiled and Rose swore softly and threw it out herself. A miner's numbers plateaued and stayed. The lattice tore in a crosswind and Jack spent 6 hours in a harness with numb hands and a song stuck uselessly in his head. They got tired enough to fight over nothing and smart enough to apologize without ceremony. On a morning like any other and therefore sacred, they walked the rows with mugs, checking leaves for the tiny dramas plants perform when they think no one is watching. Rose bumped his shoulder with hers. "Do you ever think about Murphy's?" she asked. "Every day," he said, smiling into his cup. "You regret it?" She asked it lightly, but the question had old bones. He stopped between 2 rows where the heliotoma threw a warm red on everything they loved. "I regret the parts where I thought I wasn't worth choosing," he said. "But the hand itself? The table? The dare? No. Those were just the door. You were the room." She made a face at him. That was almost poetry. "I'm learning from the company I keep." He set the mug down and reached for her, slow enough to be asked and fast enough to be sure. They kissed like people with work to do and time to do it. Overhead, the lattice hummed and the station answered, and somewhere, far off, a child laughed for no reason that required a story. That evening the colony gathered under the lattice for a vote that mattered less than the act of holding it. They named the new cooperative that would own the process, the clinic, the risks, and the future, the Copper Creek Red Array, after the way the lab shelves had looked the first week they realized they were onto something. Ezra cried and pretended it was dust. Hartwell made a speech that was almost 2 sentences long. Sorensen wrote bylaws that didn't bore anyone and went home smug. Billy watched from the edge with an expression Jack couldn't quite parse. It had less vinegar in it than usual. Maybe he was learning, too. Catherine wasn't there. Later, under the twin moons, Jack and Rose climbed to the top of the east brace. Wind braided their hair and stole the ends of their words. "Win this round and take her home," Rose said, borrowing her father's old line and setting it down in a better place. Jack looked out over Copper Creek, the stitched roofs, the stubborn lights, the bent back straightening, and then back at her. "I did," he said. "Turns out home was a person." She laughed, soft and certain, and rested her head against his shoulder. They watched the station breathe. The red fruit glowed. The future felt like something they could tend. And if this kind of human-made hope is the story you want more of, fly with us, like, subscribe, and drop a short comment for SciFi Nebula so we can keep building these futures together.